All right, diving right in. Today, we're going to tackle something that's, well, kind of at the core of how we think and understand the world. We're talking about philosophy. But don't worry, this isn't some stuffy lecture hall. We're going to keep things practical. And, maybe a little surprising. This stuff actually connects directly to fields like business and economics.
Absolutely. It's all about sharpening those critical thinking skills and that problem-solving mindset.
Exactly. So think of this deep dive as like a focused workout session, for your brain, where we zero in on one of the key methods philosophers use, conceptual analysis.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. You see, philosophy, it's kind of unique. It's not just about observing stuff like in science. It's about really examining the frameworks, the underlying structures of how we understand the world, knowledge, ethics, all of it.
So not just what we know, but why and how we know it.
Precisely. We're going to equip you with the tools to dissect and really grasp these core concepts. And to illustrate it all, we'll be looking at a super important principle, something you find in both ethics and economics, the utilitarian principle.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's zoom out for a sec. What exactly is philosophy? I mean, it's got to be more than just opinions, right?
Right, it's not just random thoughts. Philosophy is a systematic investigation, a very deliberate exploration of the core concepts and principles that shape how we make sense of, well, everything. Knowledge, ethics, reasoning, even existence itself. It's about asking why, not just settling for what.
And you're saying there are real practical benefits to wrestling with these big questions.
Huge benefits. By engaging with philosophy, you develop sharper critical thinking skills. You learn to dissect arguments, spot those inconsistencies, and you become a way more persuasive communicator.
Yeah.
Because you can actually build reasoned arguments, ones that hold water. And on top of that, you become a better problem solver. You can structure complex issues in a way that makes them, well, less overwhelming.
So philosophy can make us better thinkers, communicators, and problem solvers. Pretty solid return on investment, if you ask me.
I'd say so.
Now, let's get to conceptual analysis. This is like the bread and butter for philosophers, right? What's actually involved in this method?
It's how philosophers tackle those massive questions, the really fundamental ones. Like, what is justice? What is rational thought? What does it truly mean to be free?
Heavy stuff.
It is. And conceptual analysis is the process, the method we use to unpack these ideas.
Okay, so walk us through it. What are the steps?
So first off, you got to strive for absolute clarity. We define the concept we're looking at very precisely. No room for ambiguity.
Okay, so nail down the definition. What's next?
Then we identify the underlying principles, the rules that determine when something actually fits under that concept. Like when can we truly say something is just or rational?
So figure out the boundaries, the criteria.
Exactly. And the final step, super crucial, is to test these principles rigorously. Philosophers use thought experiments, basically hypothetical scenarios, to see if our definitions hold up.
So it's about putting these concepts through the ringer, seeing if they can stand up to scrutiny.
Right. And the goal of this whole process, our source calls it, achieving individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. It's a mouthful, I know, but it's basically the gold standard for a solid conceptual analysis.
INJS, okay, got it. What makes INJS so important?
Well, you see, individually necessary conditions, those are the criteria that absolutely have to be met for something to qualify under a concept. If even one is missing, it's a no-go. Like, think of a square. It has to have 4 sides. That's a necessary condition.
Makes sense. So if it doesn't have 4 sides, it can't be a square.
Right. Now, jointly sufficient conditions. Those are the criteria that when they're all present together, they guarantee that something belongs to that category. So for our square, it needs 4 sides, all equal length. All those angles got to be right angles. If you have all of those, bam, you've got a square, no doubt about it.
Got it. It's about establishing those precise boundaries. What makes something definitively belong to a certain category?
Exactly. And a good example, maybe a bit more intuitive, think of the concept of water. What makes something water? Well, it's got to be composed of HO. That's both necessary, can't be water if it's not HO, and sufficient if it is HO, it's water, period.
Okay, that clicks. So INJS is about having those clear, non-negotiable criteria that define a concept. Now, we're going to use this method, this whole conceptual analysis framework, to tackle a classic philosophical question. What is knowledge? And I think our material brings up epistemology here. What's that all about?
Epistemology, it's the branch of philosophy specifically focused on knowledge. What it is, how we get it, and importantly, what its limits are. It's like the philosophy of knowing.
So before we can even talk about how we know things, we need to be clear about what knowledge itself is.
Exactly. And our source does a good job of breaking down different types of knowledge because it's not all the same.
Oh, right. Like knowing how to ride a bike is different from knowing that Paris is the capital of France.
Exactly. So our source outlines three types. First, there's propositional knowledge.
Hmm.
That's the knowing that something is true. Like, you know that the Earth revolves around the sun.
Okay, propositional knowledge. What else?
Then there's knowledge how, which is knowing how to do something. Like, you know how to ride a bike or you know how to bake a cake. It's about skills and abilities.
Right, practical knowledge. And the last one.
The last one is knowledge by acquaintance, which is about being familiar with something or someone directly. Like, you know your best friend or you know the feeling of being in love. It's that firsthand experience.
Okay, three different ways of knowing. Knowing that, knowing how, and knowing by being familiar with. For today's deep dive, we're going to zero in on propositional knowledge, that whole knowing that type. And this brings us to the justified true belief account of knowledge. JTB, right. Our material presents this as the traditional understanding of knowledge.
It's a classic definition, very influential. The JTB account basically says that for someone, let's say Sarah, to know a proposition, we'll call it P, three conditions have to be met. First, P has to actually be true. Second, Sarah has to believe that P is true. And third, Sarah has to have good justification, a solid reason for believing P.
So it can't just be a random guess. You need evidence or some reason to believe it?
Right. The belief has to be justified. And the JTB account says that these three conditions, truth, belief, and justification, they're not only individually necessary, but crucially, they're jointly sufficient for knowledge.
Okay, so having a true belief that's justified, that's the recipe for knowledge, according to JTB. It seems pretty straightforward, but I have a feeling philosophy is going to throw us a curveball here.
You always got to be ready for the curveball with philosophy. And that's where thought experiments come in.
Thought experiments, like those hypothetical scenarios we talked about before.
Exactly. They're essential tools in philosophy. They let us create these imaginary situations, these what-if scenarios, to really isolate specific aspects of a concept and see how our intuitions respond. If a definition, like JTB, holds up across various well-designed thought experiments, it gets stronger support.
But if a thought experiment shows a case where the definition seems to work, but our gut feeling says, hold on, something's not right, that's a problem.
Big problem. That's what we call a counterexample. It suggests there might be a flaw in our original definition that it's not as airtight as we thought.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these thought experiments can really put these philosophical concepts to the test. And you mentioned a classic one earlier, the broken watch thought experiment. Can you unpack that for us and show how it challenges JTB?
Absolutely. So picture this. You've got a guy, let's call him David, and his watch, unfortunately, stopped working, say, 12 hours ago at exactly 3:00 p.m. David's completely oblivious to this, though. Now, the next day, at precisely 3:00 p.m., he happens to glance at his watch. What does he see? 3:00. Naturally, he forms the belief that it's 3:00 p.m.
Seems reasonable enough.
Right. Now, let's hold this belief up against the JTB criteria. First, is his belief true? Well, yeah, it actually is 3:00 p.m.
Okay, check for truth. What about belief?
He clearly believes it's 3:00 p.m. That's why he's, going about his day. And what about justification? Well, usually looking at your watch is a totally reliable way to know the time.
Yeah, it's not like he's just making it up.
Exactly. So according to the JTB account, all three boxes are checked. True belief, justified. David knows the time. But here's the thing. Does he really know it? It feels more like he just got super lucky. His broken watch happened to show the right time at that exact moment.
Right. It's not like he has any good reason to think his watch is accurate. It's pure chance.
Exactly. And that's the problem the broken watch thought experiment highlights. Our intuition screams, no, he doesn't know the time. But the JTB criteria are all met. So this disconnect, this clash between the definition and our gut feeling, it suggests that maybe just having a justified true belief isn't always enough for knowledge.
There's something missing from the equation.
It seems that way. And this thought experiment isn't alone. There are others that raise similar problems for JTB.
So when philosophers encounter these pesky counterexamples, how do they usually deal with them? Do they just abandon the whole theory?
Not necessarily. There are a few common strategies. One approach is to tweak the principle, revise it. So in the case of JTB, there have been tons of attempts to add a fourth condition, something to rule out cases like the broken watch. For example, some argue that the justification itself needs to be connected to the truth in the right way, not just be some random coincidental thing.
So patch up the theory to account for the problem cases. What are the other options?
Another approach is to take aim at the counterexample itself. Some philosophers might say, hold on, in that broken watch scenario, David's belief isn't truly justified because, the instrument he's relying on is fundamentally flawed, even if he doesn't know it.
So challenge the counterexample, argue that it doesn't actually apply.
Right. And then there's the third option, which is less common, but definitely on the table. It's called biting the bullet.
Biting the bullet sounds painful.
It can be. It means accepting the counterintuitive conclusion, saying, you know what, maybe David does know the time, even though it feels weird to say it.
So stick to your guns, even if it leads to some strange outcomes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But philosophers tend to prefer revising the principle or questioning the counterexample because our considered intuitions, those gut feelings we have after careful thought, they're actually seen as important data in philosophy. They can point us towards where our theories might be going wrong.
Interesting. So it's not just about abstract logic. Our intuitions play a role too.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got a good handle on how conceptual analysis works. Define the concept, test it rigorously with thought experiments, and pay attention to where our intuitions clash with a theory. Now, let's shift gears and apply the same method to a principle that's super important in ethics and economics, the utilitarian principle.
UP, as our material calls it.
Right. Just like we dissected that JTB account of knowledge, we can use these thought experiments to explore the strengths and potential weaknesses of UP. And our source sets us up with 3 interesting dilemmas.
Let's dive into them. The first one, the lifeboat scenario. That's a classic.
A real ethical head-scratcher.
Okay, so you've got a lifeboat, but it's got limited capacity. There's one person stranded on one island, 5 people on another. You only have enough fuel to reach one island. What do you do?
Tough choice. Now, the utilitarian principle, remember, it says the morally right action is the one that maximizes total individual well-being. So in this case, rescuing the 5 people seems like it would produce the greatest overall well-being, right? More lives saved, more happiness, less suffering.
And intuitively, I think most people would agree, saving 5 lives is better than saving 1.
Yeah, the lifeboat scenario is a case where the utilitarian principle's recommendation kind of lines up with our initial moral intuition. So you could say it offers some support for UP, but things get a lot more complicated with the next thought experiment.
That's the organ harvesting problem, right? This one gets pretty intense, ethically speaking.
It definitely pushes some buttons. Imagine this. You've got 5 patients in a hospital, each one desperately needing a different organ transplant to survive. Now, a perfectly healthy individual, who's called Michael, comes in for a routine checkup. And wouldn't you know it, he's a perfect match for all 5 patients.
Talk about bad luck.
Yeah, it's a tragic situation. Now, if we're strictly following the utilitarian principle, maximizing overall well-being, it might seem like harvesting Michael's organs to save those 5 lives is the morally right thing to do. But does that sit right with you?
Not at all. It feels deeply wrong to sacrifice one person, even if it means saving 5 others, especially when that person is completely innocent and hasn't consented to this.
Exactly. Our moral intuition screams at us, this is wrong. We have this deep-seated sense that it's wrong to intentionally harm an innocent person, even for a greater good. This conflict, this clash between what the utilitarian principle seems to imply and our deeply held moral beliefs, that's what makes the organ harvesting problem such a powerful counterexample to UP.
It makes you question whether maximizing total well-being should always be the top priority.
Right. It forces us to consider whether there are other moral values at play, things like individual rights and the inherent wrongness of certain actions that might override the simple calculation of maximizing well-being.
Okay, so we've got the lifeboat scenario where UP seems to work, and the organ harvesting problem where it clashes with our intuition. What about the third thought experiment?
That's the World Cup dilemma, and it also throws a wrench into the utilitarian machine.
Lay it on us.
All right, imagine this. You've got a guy, let's call him Bob, who's trapped inside a broadcasting studio. He's injured, in pain, needs help ASAP. Meanwhile, millions of people around the world are glued to their TVs, eagerly waiting for the World Cup final to start, a match they've been looking forward to for ages.
Can't miss the World Cup final.
Right. Now, here's the catch. Rescuing Bob immediately would mean interrupting the broadcast for, let's say, 15 minutes.
Causing widespread disappointment and frustration for those millions of viewers.
Exactly. Now, if you're a hardcore utilitarian, you might say, well, look, the temporary displeasure of those millions outweighs Bob's suffering, which, while serious, is temporary. Delay the rescue, let everyone enjoy the match. But again, does that feel right?
Nope. It feels like Bob's immediate well-being should take priority, regardless of the inconvenience to the soccer fans.
Right, our intuition pulls us toward Bob, the individual's immediate need, even if it means temporarily disrupting the happiness of a larger group.
So, these three thought experiments, they paint a pretty complex picture. In one case, UP seems to get it right, but in the other two, it leads to conclusions that feel morally wrong. It really makes you wonder if UP can be a reliable guide for moral decision-making.
It definitely exposes some potential limitations of the principle, especially when you've got situations involving conflicting rights or where causing harm seems unavoidable.
So, where do we go from here? Do we just scrap the whole utilitarian principle?
Not so fast.
Mhm.
Our source, to help us unpack this, explains that the utilitarian principle, as articulated by philosopher Christer Bykvist, can actually be broken down into 5 more fundamental principles, 5 underlying assumptions, if you will. And by analyzing these components individually, we can start to pinpoint where those counterintuitive results might be stemming from.
So instead of treating UP as this monolithic, take it or leave it idea, we can actually dissect it, see what makes it tick.
Precisely. And this isn't just some theoretical exercise. Understanding these underlying principles is super relevant if you're diving into things like welfare economics or economic policy, areas where utilitarian thinking has had a huge impact.
Okay, so let's get to those 5 foundational principles that make up utilitarianism. What are they?
All right, buckle up. First, you've got consequentialism, often labeled P1. This is the idea that the morality of an action, whether it's right or wrong, is determined solely by its consequences, the outcomes it produces. Good outcome, good action. Bad outcome, bad action.
So judge an action by its results. What's the second principle?
Second, you've got welfarism, P2. This one claims that well-being, happiness, the good life, however you want to define it, is the only thing that has intrinsic moral value. Everything else is only good insofar as it contributes to well-being.
So well-being is the ultimate goal, the measuring stick for morality.
All right. Now, the third principle is the weak Pareto principle, or P3. This one states that if everyone is better off in one possible outcome compared to another, then that first outcome is morally superior. Basically, if everyone wins, that's the best option.
Makes sense. So universal improvement equals moral improvement.
Exactly. Now, the fourth principle gets a bit trickier. It's cardinal comparability, P4. This assumes that we can not only measure individuals' levels of well-being, but we can also compare those levels across different people in a meaningful way.
So not just saying this person is happier than that person, but actually quantifying those differences in a way that allows for comparisons and calculations.
Right, and that's a big assumption, because how do you actually measure happiness or well-being in a way that allows for objective comparisons? That's a debate in itself.
It's like comparing apples and oranges.
Exactly. And finally, we've got transitional equity, P5. This principle says that if you transfer a unit of well-being from one person to another without changing the total amount of well-being, that transfer is morally neutral. So basically, it doesn't matter who has the well-being as long as the total amount stays the same.
So the distribution of well-being is irrelevant. Only the total sum matters.
Right. So those are the 5 building blocks of the utilitarian principle. Each one has its own set of implications and potential problems. And that's what makes this deconstruction so valuable. It allows us to zoom in on each individual principle and ask, okay, is this where the tension is coming from? Is this assumption causing the counterintuitive results we saw in those thought experiments?
So the utilitarian principle, which initially seemed so simple, just maximize overall well-being, turns out to be way more complex when you really break it down.
Exactly. And as our source points out, subsequent deep dives will actually tackle each of these 5 principles in greater depth. So if you want to really get a grip on utilitarianism and its complexities, especially as they relate to economics and policy, stick with us. And remember, you can always find a full summary and some practice tests on gradeguru.nl to test your understanding.
Awesome. This deep dive has been like a crash course in conceptual analysis, from those basic steps to seeing how it's used to examine big ideas like the JTB theory of knowledge and the utilitarian principle. We've seen how those thought experiments can really expose the strengths and weaknesses of these ideas, and how those clashes between logic and our gut feelings, our intuitions, push philosophical inquiry forward.
Right, those clusters, they're not the end of the story. They're the starting point for deeper exploration. And the utilitarian principle, while incredibly influential, definitely faces some serious challenges when we put it through the conceptual analysis ringer. That seeming simplicity masks a whole bunch of underlying assumptions that we need to examine carefully.
Exactly. So let's do a quick recap for our listeners. We started with the question, what is philosophy? And talked about its value in shaping us into better thinkers, communicators, and problem solvers. Then we dug into the method of conceptual analysis, using the JTB theory of knowledge as our first example. We saw how thought experiments, like the broken watch scenario, can expose cracks in seemingly solid theories.
And then we shifted gears to the utilitarian principle, that idea of maximizing overall well-being, and put it to the test using those three thought experiments: the lifeboat dilemma, the organ harvesting problem, and the World Cup dilemma. Each one highlighting different potential conflicts and raising questions about the principle's absolute validity.
And finally, we peeled back the layers of UP and uncovered those 5 fundamental principles it's built on: consequentialism, welfarism, the weak Pareto principle, cardinal comparability, and transitional equity, each one worthy of deeper exploration in its own right.
Absolutely. So, as you continue to ponder all this, here's a question to chew on. Given all those tensions we've uncovered, those clashes between maximizing well-being and our sense of individual rights and fairness, which of those 5 underlying principles of utilitarianism do you find most compelling or maybe most problematic? And why? Think about it, and maybe we'll revisit this in a future deep dive.
Food for thought. Until then, happy philosophizing.